Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Daniel Culbertson, economist with the Indeed Hiring Lab, and it is time for another U.S. labor market update. What I'd like to do in this short video is talk about two different topics. First, I'd like to talk about what we learned about the labor market from last week's Bureau of Labor Statistics Employment Situation Report, or the jobs report, if you will. And I'd also like to talk about what trends we've uncovered using Indeed's data set and Indeed Hiring Lab research. As always, all of the research produced by the Indeed Hiring Lab can be found on our blog at hiringlab.org, which is a free resource of information that's available for employers and anyone else who's interested in labor market research. So as always, I encourage you all to check that out. Getting started with what we know about the labor market from public data. As many of you may have seen in the news just before the July 4th holiday, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics put out their employment situation report for the month of June. And inside of this jobs report, we get a lot of great information about the overall U.S. labor market. One of the numbers that are most important in that report is the total count of employment in the U.S. economy. During the month of June, the U.S. economy added 4.8 million jobs, which is an incredibly large number. However, this chart here helps us put that number into perspective. This chart is the total level of employment in the U.S. economy. And as you can see on the far right side of this chart, once we hit March and COVID-19 became a problem inside the United States, payrolls in the U.S. economy fell quite drastically. And although we've added jobs over the past 2 months, we still have a long way to go before we get back to where we were. In fact, the U.S. labor market is still about 15 million jobs short of where we were before this all started just a few short months ago in February of 2020. Out of the 4.8 million jobs that we added in the month of June, about 2.1 million of those were inside of leisure and hospitality, which is one of the sectors that was hardest hit by COVID-19. And we also saw some pretty substantial gains in retail, which is another one of those service industries that was pretty severely impacted by COVID-19. So it is obviously great to see those sectors beginning to bounce back. One of the other important numbers that we get from the BLS Employment Situation Report is the overall unemployment rate. From the month of May to June, the unemployment rate fell from 13.3% to where it is today at 11.1%. Obviously, it's great to see this decline in overall unemployment. But again, as this chart shows, we do have a long way to go before we get back to the low unemployment rate of 3.5%, 4% that we had before all of this started. And this is a short video, so I won't get too deep into it, but I should mention that there is a lot of nuance and a lot of other aspects of the U.S. labor market that are included inside this employment situation report that factor into unemployment that economists will be keeping an eye on in the next couple months to get a better picture of the overall health of the labor market. And some of those numbers that I mean, or that I'm talking about, are how much temporary unemployment will ultimately end up being permanent. We're going to be keeping an eye on the number of people who are working part-time but would like to be working full-time, the number of people who are marginally attached to the labor force, and the number of people who have dropped out of the labor force altogether. So these are some of the finer aspects of the unemployment rate that economists will be keeping an eye on in the coming months to get a true sense of the labor market health. And this is something that we can include in an update a little further down the road once we have a more clear picture. Moving on to so far what we have seen in Indeed's data. So all of the job postings, the job search, and the resume information that Indeed has in its own data set can provide a different and sort of complementary look at the overall labor market compared to the data that we typically get from the US government. One of the things that we've been following in our data set is the overall trend in job postings on our site. And shown here in this chart is how that trend has changed over the past 3 years. So this chart is just looking back at 3 years worth of job postings trends on Indeed. And on this chart, each one of these trends is indexed to February 1st. And that's just so all these trend lines start at the same point, and we can get a sense of how these trend lines develop over time. Obviously, the big difference for 2020 is around mid-March, once COVID-19 started to really become a problem in the United States. Similar to what we saw in the public data with employment counts dropping, we saw the overall count of job postings on our site fall pretty drastically, and the number of job postings on our site continued to fall until they bottomed out around the beginning of May. Since the beginning of May, we have seen job postings on Indeed steadily climb back. But again, similar to that public data, we still have a pretty far way to go before we are back to where we were before all this started. As of July 3rd, so this is pretty recent data, the trend so far in 2020 is about 25% below the trend in 2019. So still a little bit of ground to be made up there. Diving deeper into the postings data, we can get a sense of what sectors have been most impacted by COVID-19, and we can also get a sense of what sectors have begun to bounce back and which sectors are driving that slow climb in job postings that we're seeing on Indeed. This table tells us all of that. So starting at the bottom of the table with that second column right in the middle of the chart, we can see that hospitality and tourism is still the industry that is most impacted by COVID-19 compared to where they were as of July 3rd of this year compared to the same point in the year prior. Hospitality and tourism postings are down about 53%. With hospitality and tourism, we have a lot of other service industries that require a lot of face-to-face contact, like arts and entertainment and childcare, that are also suffering some of the biggest impacts from COVID-19. Here in the middle of the chart, we have some industries that are faring more or less in line with the overall economy. Things like software development, nursing, food preparation, and service are more or less performing on average. And here at the top of the chart, we have some of the sectors that are holding up relatively well. For example, retail and driving, if you look at their trend this year compared to last year, they are more or less back to their trend level from the year prior. In the third column, all the way on the right side of the chart, we can get a sense of how these sectors have performed since May 1st. And this is just looking at the percent change since then. So you can see it's a bit of a mixed bag here. We have some industries that have begun to bounce back in pretty solid numbers, like food service and prep, childcare, retail, driving, beauty and wellness in particular. These are industries where job postings have increased since May 1st. But we also have some industries like banking and finance, arts and entertainment, nursing is another one, that haven't begun to bounce back nearly as the rest. And overall, the impact of COVID-19 was felt broadly across the labor market. Pretty much every industry is still in a hole compared to where they were last year, and they still have some ground to be made up. But here from our data, we can see there are some industries that have begun to bounce back, and these are all industries that we will certainly be keeping an eye on as we continue to monitor developments in the labor market over the next couple months. As always, all of the information, all of the research that we do here at the Indeed Hiring Lab can be found on our blog at hiringlab.org. Some of those trends that I just covered in our data are updated weekly on our site, so I encourage you all to check that out. And if you are on Twitter, a lot of our U.S. economists do a great job of providing updates in our research and also what else is going on around the economy. That's all for now. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you all next time.